Welcome to the Informed Simplicity Project. I'm Dr. Jordan Harris here with Dr. Julia Conroy. In this series, we're taking a shared journey to learn more about how stress impacts our bodies from a polyvagal perspective. Let's recap. From a polyvagal perspective, stress affects our emotional and physical health. When stressed, we have 3 levels of responding, depending on the intensity of the stressor. So when we're challenged, we use the first level response of co-regulation. This is what is called our social engagement response. Think about a kid you know, right? Maybe they fall down and they scrape their knee. And what they'll do is they'll often go to a parent or a caregiver for some sort of comfort, right? For like a hug or like a kiss. That's co-regulation in action. And when we're not challenged, we use the same social engagement system to enjoy being with others. And this is also the level and the state that we have to be in for our bodies to heal and to grow. But what if the stressor is more than just a challenge? What if it's an actual perceived threat? Then we use a second level response, a fight or flight. And sometimes it's more than a threat that we're facing. Sometimes it's an absolute sort of life threat experience. Our bodies think that they're going to die. Then we use what's called a freeze response. Now, freezing isn't only about freezing. It's about going numb, dissociating, fainting, and generally shutting down. So to understand the impacts of these 3 levels of responding, the social engagement system, our fight or flight response, and our freeze response, on our mental health and our physical health, we're looking at the extensive body of research on how stress impacts our bodies. And our main text for this is Robert Sapolsky's classic book, Why Zebras Don't Get Ulcers. And today, we're looking at the reproductive system. So Julia, with that mouthful, how are you doing today?
Good. Honestly, I haven't talked about the reproductive system since like 9th grade biology. This is a lot more helpful than that was. I think maybe it's just because I'm not,
In 9th
15
grade
anymore,
anymore.
and like not just like giggling my way through it. Because I should call, Mrs. Young, my biology teacher, and apologize. But I'm really excited about this. I think the reproductive system is one that is so tied to such intimate parts of our life that it can be really distressing to people when there's some sort of maladaptive functioning going on. And I think it's really valuable just to sit with, so what impact does stress have on this? And just really valuable to learn a bit more about that. So I'm excited to jump in today. What about you?
Yeah, I think that you're right. I think this is a topic that is so tied into people's sense of identity, and so it can be very sensitive.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, the chapter sort of divided into male anatomy and then female anatomy. And he spends a lot of time talking about genitals and how they function. And yeah, I mean, those are problems that I think really touch home for people. So I'm excited to get into this. I'm also like you. I mean, I remember asking some really weird questions in Coach Lambert's biology class when I was a freshman in high school, right? And
oh, good.
And not
they put the coach on. They're like, Coach, you take this.
Yeah. And so, yeah, reading through this as an adult, a little bit more mature, but also I think having also read the rest of the book makes the rest of this chapter make sense for me, right? Like our bodies are responding to what's going on around us. It's not doing something weird. It's not doing something strange. It might be not what you want, right? But once you understand, okay, this is what is happening, and this is what my body is responding to, it makes your body's response make sense. And so I really appreciated that part of this. And then, Sapolsky is just hilarious. And so he's got a section on hyenas in this that I don't think we'll get to, but I'll put into the show notes.
We'll recommend. It's worth a read.
And we'll
I'll
recommend.
never watch The Lion King the same.
You'll never watch The Lion King the same at all. Yeah, but even in that, right? Like it makes The Lion King make more sense.
Yeah, that's fair.
In some ways. So yeah, I have a video of him talking about his hyena section. We'll put into the show notes and people can enjoy that. So yeah, let's sort of dive in here. So he starts off talking about male anatomy. And basically what he says is your brain, that the way that the male reproductive system works, right, is pretty simple, right? He almost says
comparatively, yeah.
comparatively, and he's almost like, it's boring. like it's just this is what happens. And so he says basically, the brain releases LHRH, which is a hormone that in a roundabout way starts the process that ends with the creation of sperm and the testes releasing testosterone. Mm-hmm. And when stressed, this system shuts down. Which makes sense, right? I mean, this whole book has been about how when we're stressed, the long-term sort of bodily functions sort of shut off, and the things we need for the immediate present sort of jack up, right? They increase. So he has this quote, right? And I think I love this quote because one of the things that I didn't get about polyvagal theory is how your body doesn't really differentiate from stressors. So he says, if a male goes through surgery, within seconds of the first slice of a scalpel through skin, the reproductive system begins to shut down. And as a therapist who has learned a lot about trauma, how trauma impacts the body, it's a good reminder to remember that surgery, even though it's a thing that's for a good end, is in some ways traumatic for the body. Like your body's going to turn on a high level stress response.
And what a good thing that is, right? That being cut open, our body has a response to that. That's like, wait, no, this is not what's supposed to happen, right? Again, it's like, no, I know that this surgery is okay. I know it's for a good reason. Like I'm choosing to have this. This could potentially even be life-saving, right? This could improve my quality of life. This is a good thing. That cognitive awareness doesn't get passed down to these just years upon years upon years of our bodies being ingrained with the message. If you are cut open, that is a bad thing. I am stressed. We need to conserve blood. Don't send it to that area. Prioritize sealing that up. Do what we need to. It's a trauma, right? And it's actually a very good thing that our body responds to it that way. And because if we're cut open under other circumstances, we need our bodies to kick in with that response.
And I think even so there's definitely the socialization part. And then also I think the biology, right? I think it's wired into you that if something is cutting into your flesh, whether it's a lion, whether it's a hyena on the savannah, or if it's a doctor, this is a problem. So I thought that was, for me, a good reminder. The other thing that he says is stress also makes it hard to get or keep an erection. And he goes into how this happens, right? Basically, the parasympathetic nervous system is what controls an erection. In order to get an erection, you have to be sort of relaxed and feel safe. And he even uses the word vegetative, right? Which is sort of a really interesting word, given that typically in polyvagal areas, we think of vegetative as being sort of like a freeze sort of response. But he says, okay, because the parasympathetic nervous system, the parasympathetic branch, is the one that sort of controls the erection, that sounds really confusing to people initially. because when you're having sex, your heart rate goes up, your breathing goes up. Like, it doesn't seem like a very vegetative, sort of relaxed thing. And he says this is because the sympathetic nervous system, the sympathetic branch, is what controls ejaculation. And so
Mhm.
what you're seeing is these two systems really coordinating
Mm.
really well, right? Where the parasympathetic starts off sort of um, taking charge and leading the way, right?
Mhm.
And then as arousal increases, you the sympathetic comes online, and there's
Mhm.
this sort of handing off of the baton,
Mhm.
which sort of, at least for men, is what then leads to ejaculation.
Right, which is very polyvagal, right? That these both the parasympathetic and the sympathetic nervous system are working in conjunction based on circumstance, right? And based on the level of stimulation that's present, right? Which is what the polyvagal theory says. As we're relaxed, as we're calm, it's not this system fighting against each other, but it's this passing off of a baton as our body seeks to respond the best that it can to the level of stimulation that's present, which is a good thing, right? And very against this idea that we've talked about literature like pitted against sympathetic and parasympathetic for so long. I think that this is one of the best examples that shows they're very much working in conjunction with one another, um, to according to the level of stimulation present, to give the body what it needs. And that's a really, really good thing.
Yeah. I think for me, something we haven't talked about before that is, I've not heard this stated super directly, but I've listened to so much of, Porges talk about this, is that our nervous system can also blend different states, right?
Mm.
And so Porges, in some of his stuff, I think he's got a paper on love. Anyway, basically what he says is, we not only is there a hierarchy of responding, right, where you have a social engagement response, and you have a fight or flight response, and you have a freeze response, depending on the level of the stressor, right, the intensity of the stressor. But also, if you're able to keep the social engagement system open and functioning, it allows for you to use that social engagement system in novel ways, right? And so he talks about play. He says play is so important for kids because that's when they're blending the social engagement system with the fight or flight system.
Mhm.
And actually, the way that they learn to use that fight or flight system in a way that's really sort of healthy is by being able to
Mhm.
also use the social engagement system.
Mhm.
So he has this
Simultaneously. Yeah.
simultaneously, right?
Mhm.
And that's why he says things like face-to-face play and
Mhm.
reciprocal play are so important. He has this
Mhm.
great clip of two basketball players who are like best friends, and one of them knocks the other one down and keeps on playing, and then a fight breaks out. And basically what he says is, if you look at what happened, the guy who gets knocked down then looks to his friend. He's trying to make that face-to-face contact.
Mhm.
Um, but his friend isn't looking. His friend is
Mhm.
off doing something else. So the guy's knocked down makes this bid for connection.
Mhm.
Because it's not reciprocated, that starts the fight. And so he's
Exactly.
trying to keep that social engagement channel open.
Mhm.
Um,
Yeah. We'd like to. It sounds good. It's what we're bent toward, but when we get a clear message that that's not available, it's not a conscious choice,
right.
right? It that happens within milliseconds that fight flight response is activated. And I'm really glad that you gave that example too, because obviously there's like physical activity being done, right? But there's also a level of psychological stress
Yeah.
in that moment too. And I think nobody would argue, I'm not really in the mood after I've run a marathon. I'm pretty tired, like sex drive is super high in those moments, like my body's pretty depleted. But the same is true that we found. There are several studies that have been done on psychological stress. Even doing things like a stressful learning task have been shown to reduce levels of testosterone. And so I want to make that really clear. And we've been, keeping that another theme as we've gone through these episodes, but I think especially when it comes to sex and sexual drive, and the reproductive system, I think there's even more of a leaning, right, to make that about the physical nature. This is surgery, this is physical exhaustion, but this also extends to this psychological stress too, right? That even that has been shown to significantly impair testosterone levels. Again, that causes this same shutting down of the system, like you said, when we're not able to activate that social engagement system, when that bid for connection is not met.
Yeah, and he talks about that, right? He talks about
Mhm.
how part of the problem with stress and erections is that when you're stressed, it's harder to get an erection, and then not having an erection, not being able to get or keep an erection, is also stressful. And
Right.
so that's the psychological part of it, right?
Hmm.
Where the psychology of it then also feeds back onto itself and makes it harder, um, unless you can have that safe and social engagement system sort of kick online.
Yeah, it's a vicious cycle, right? Because when I'm uh like as a man, if I'm unable to get stimulated, I start to think about myself, what's wrong with me, what's going on here. I kind of turn inwardly. That's not exactly when I'd be most prone to reach out for comfort in that
Yeah,
moment, right? And that's definitely not what culture teaches us to
yeah,
do in that moment.
yeah,
But what polyvagal theory would suggest is reaching out for that sense of comfort, right, actually diminishes that stress, so that those systems can come online.
yeah, yeah. Um, which I think is really important because he even says that 50% of the time when men go in to see their doctor
Mhm.
for an issue like struggling to get an erection,
Yeah.
there's a psychological component, right? It's stress induced,
Mhm.
which I think is um, really normalizing, right? If
Mhm.
half of the time people go in to the doctor because they can't get or keep an erection, that's a lot of people.
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
remember going through my own sex training in my master's program, and these are, at least for, well, there's different parts of this, but for men, these issues are so common, but we don't talk about them. And so many people are walking around feeling like, oh wait, like I have this big problem, you know? And it's like, no, this is actually your body responding to normal everyday stressing environments.
Mhm.
And almost everybody goes through this at some point in their lives. And if we can just talk about it, then you can know that you're not weird or strange and your body's not doing
Mhm.
anything abnormal.
Yeah.
And actually, kind of like we're saying with the polyvagal perspective, the
Mhm.
more you're able to sort of talk about that and be open about
Mhm.
that and almost be comfortable with the fact that this is how my body responds, that's what's going to be the biggest thing that's going to help you
Mhm.
to actually relax.
Mhm.
So then you can get an erection and enjoy
Yeah.
your sexual
Which
experience.
is so countercultural, right? And so I think there just is so much potential or shame and embarrassment to come in. That's not exactly a reflex. It makes me think of a couple I was working with yesterday, and they were celebrating an anniversary, and they had made plans like, we're having sex tonight, we're going to do this. And build up, for weeks. They've got this plan. This is going to be great. We're going to get a hotel, and that we're so excited about all these things. And they're sharing about this experience. And as they're getting back to the hotel room and things are starting up, he's not able to have an erection, right? And he's just so disappointed. He's so frustrated
Yeah.
in those moments. But he said, I made the decision. It would be okay if we could just be close, right? We don't have kids bursting in the room. So if we can just be close, that's okay, right? And they started cuddling and they started, just kissing and enjoying one another. And after about 15 minutes, he was able to get an erection, right? And he's like, I don't know, it just happened. And it's like, okay, no, what we do know, right? There's so much pressure, there's so
But
much
we do know.
stress
We know what
around this.
actually happened.
It was kind of stressful getting to the hotel, right? All of those um, things, our systems are kind of still shut down. And the reason why, right, I'm then able to be stimulated in the ways that I want to be, right, is because my body actually relaxed, is because I felt safe, is because I felt calm, especially in the arms of my partner. And then my body is able to function in the way that it needs to.
Yeah. I also love that you just said the 15-minute thing. Something I think people really need to learn or hear is that it takes time,
Mm-hmm.
right? I mean, Gottman talks about this. The people who do the HRV stuff talk about this. In order for your body to really sort of shift down,
Mm-hmm.
it takes time.
Mm-hmm.
I think sometimes when things happen instantly, but that's just not how life is. So,
Mm-hmm.
um, the other thing it talks about then is like, okay, so if half of the time people come in to see the doctor and there's a stress and the lack of erection is stress induced, how do you know which is which? And he actually has a really sort of fun way to talk about this, right? He says, you can go to a sex therapist or some sort of physician, they'll give you a penile cuff. But also he's like, what the sex therapists do is they tell the men to put a ring of stamps around their penis. Because if you do this before bed, men get erections when they go into REM sleep, when they go into REM sleep. And so if you check it in the morning and the ring of stamps has been broken, you know that when you were asleep, you had an erection. I thought that's pretty ingenious. Like that's kind of a clever way to handle this. And so, yeah, you can get a ring of stamps if you want, or, you can go get a penile cuff and sort of check that way.
Mm-hmm.
I wanted to return back to this idea though of blends, of blended states, right? So we say that play is a blended state. So you can use social engagement and also fight or flight at the same time. And Portis talks about how sex is sort of a blended state as well, right? Usually you're asking one partner to be immobile, which is sort of that freeze sort of level, but then also, you need to be safe, right? And he also talks about, and so you're seeing like that sort of social engagement plus the sort of freeze state, but he also talks about nursing, right, as a blended state. And that's why he says that moms and babies sort of gaze into each other's eyes when the baby is nursing, because they're communicating to each other. It's safe to be still. It's safe to be still. And for me, that really opened up sort of the theory a lot more, right? To say, okay, it's not always just about being happy and safe, but it's also about how do you pull in these relationships to make the other parts of your experience safe, so that you can then be really still and feel safe, so that you can then be mobilized and feel safe, right? It's not just about staying in that sort of medium area where you're just doing the safe and social stuff. So I thought that was really important.
Oh, absolutely.
What about you, Julia? Did you have anything else in this section on male anatomy that you wanted to touch on?
Yeah, I think just And I think you did a great job of kind of leading that summary there, but I just think of just the amount of, and we touched on this briefly, but just the amount of shame that I know is present with
Mm,
male clients that I've worked with erectile dysfunction or any sort of sexual issues. Um, that it's so painful that what polyvagal suggests would be the very solution, right, to those issues, right, and to those ways that it's functioning maladaptively is comfort, is safety, is connection. But that makes a really conscious choice to do the very opposite thing that shame tells us to do.
mm,
And so I think that this is a really, really important message for everyone to hear, but especially as a clinician, kind of appreciating the fact that the very thing that's often needed in those circumstances is safety and comfort, but it's the very last resort that our body wants to go to because shame tells us to turn away and to be by ourselves, and to not address it. So figuring out how to balance, right? That pulling away response makes sense. And yet it kind of further exacerbates that stress that's already present. And I think just appreciating the bond that many male clients find themselves in.
yeah, it is kind of a bind, right? It's
Mhm.
like I need connection in order to feel safe, in order to actually have sex, or at least to have an erection and then have, you know, yeah. But that feels like the most dangerous thing on the planet to me in those moments because
Mhm.
of the level of shame that I feel.
Yeah.
I think the therapist move, at least for me, the first therapy move is having people being able to say that to their partner.
Mhm.
You know,
It's huge.
it's huge. And I think that's what begins, at least at the beginning, to dispel some of that shame.
Because what does it do? It turns on some of that social engagement
Right.
system, burdens some of that stress, decreases that limbic response, right? So I can actually receive some comfort there. Um, if the couple is de-escalated enough to get a good response there. Which sometimes is saying something.
Yeah, sometimes it's
Um,
not.
yeah,
Yeah.
but I think you're totally right. That's the number one thing to activate that social engagement system to kind of dial down that stress response,
Yeah.
and to get the closeness that we all need there.
Yeah. Okay. So female anatomy. Um, in some ways, I was surprised at how similar parts of this are, right? So he starts off
Mm,
saying, the brain for females secretes LHRH, and that stimulates estrogen production and stimulates the ovaries to release eggs. Um, and I was like, oh, that sounds kind of like, the testosterone and the sperm for like men.
mhm,
And then they go into how there are other hormones that impact women, right? And so he talks about um, how the ovaries produce estrogen, and also women have androgen, which is produced by the adrenal glands. And then the body takes androgen and actually converts it to estrogen. But in order to do this, it needs fat, which is, as soon as he said this, I thought, oh my God, I know where he's going with this, right?
mm,
And he says, oh, like, this is why oftentimes women who've been through some sort of famine or like their bodies really struggle to get pregnant, right?
mhm,
Because androgen actually inhibits pregnancy,
mhm,
right? Um, and then he takes it one step further and he says, this is also why women who struggle with anorexia nervosa often have reproductive issues
mhm,
because they don't have enough fat
mhm.
in order for their body to convert the androgen into estrogen,
Mhm.
because
Right.
androgen stops the reproductive process. And I thought,
Mhm.
yep, I've
Yeah.
seen that. Like that make sense.
Right. And so that androgen is the same one that's found in uh, like a male's hormonal system, right? And so it suppresses females' biological fertility. And so when it is more dominant in the bloodstream, because it can't be converted to estrogen, there is a decrease in that potential to get pregnant, but also just kind of impacts just a regular menstrual cycle as well, because again, the body's like, all right, we're shutting this down. There's more androgen in the system that's not being converted. And so that kind of suppresses this natural cycle that takes place.
Yeah. Um, and then he also goes into talking about how you see the same sort of thing with like competitive runners and like high level athletes.
Yeah.
And I was like, holy smokes. He talks, he says, up to half of competitive runners have menstrual irregularities, and highly athletic girls reach puberty later than usual. Right? That's because when they're that fit, when they're and their bodies are stressed, they don't have as much fat. Right? For example, he says in one study of 14-year-olds, 95% of control subjects, 95% of just, random, everyday 14-year-old females had started menstruating, whereas only 20% of gymnasts and 40% of runners had. So you can really see like the difference that levels of fat make for the female body and estrogen. And I was like, that's wild.
Absolutely.
It also made sense to me. I don't know if you've experienced this with your clients or even with friends or whatnot, because I've heard women talk about having irregular menstrual cycles. And to me that, not being someone who read this stuff at the time, I was like, that just sounds like weird to me. Like, why would your cycle be irregular? But it's like, actually, it's pretty normal if you don't have a lot of estrogen, or if you are like really low weight, or for whatever reason, like don't have a lot of fat stores. Like that's just what your body does. So for me, that was also sort of like an aha moment of making sense of the things I've heard in the past from other women.
Yes, absolutely. Kind of this bifold effect of the things that deplete women's estrogen levels. That high amounts of stress, right? Just the same hormones that kind of start that cascading effect are not secreted, right? So there's not as much estrogen released. But also, if the body isn't able to have enough fat to convert, right, that androgen into estrogen, this androgen actually is very intentionally trying to suppress the female body's capacity to get pregnant. And I think Sapolsky does a great job of explaining why this is, because again, nothing's malfunctioning in this, but what the body is picking up on is if we don't have enough fat to convert this androgen to estrogen, we probably don't have enough fat to support another human life. So let's pump the brakes on this, right? Let's make sure that there's more androgen in the system, because this is not going to end well in a healthy pregnancy. So let's slow this menstrual cycle down. It is incredibly adaptive that the body has that kind of foresight to say, hey, we need to slow down this reproductive cycle that could end in a female supporting another human life, because we don't have the resources to do that, right? Whether that be due to famine, whether that's due to restricted eating that is chosen or not. And so it's incredibly adaptive of the body to register that and then protect the body from a very expensive process, because pregnancy tends to be a pretty metabolically expensive process for the body.
Oh my gosh. When he says that, a typical pregnancy is 50,000 calories, I was like, holy smokes, like that's a lot, right? It is metabolically intensive. He even says that nursing on average is about 1,000 calories a day. Like it takes 1,000 calories a day from the female. And I was like, that's a lot. That's a lot. So
Mm-hmm.
yes, how wise everybody to say, wait, we don't have those resources right now.
Mm-hmm.
So we're going to slow things down until you have what you need in order to do this.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Insane.
Mm-hmm.
Insane. Um, so anything else on this section, Julia? I'm really interested in the next section, but I wanted to sort of see if there's anything else about this.
Yeah, this is again, I think just from a clinical perspective, something that I hear a lot because we talked a lot about, the way that there's just such good intention behind our bodies of how they kind of regulate these hormones, of how fat stores are used and so essential. But I also did just want to touch on because Zapolsky does this really well as well of women's libido or their sex drive. And I think there's like a really common cultural perception that women just don't want sex as much, they don't need sex as much. Um, and so I've seen clients that's like, I want sex. Is something wrong with me? But also women that are like, I just don't want it at all. Like the thought just like is repulsive to me. Right. And I think it's just really important to touch on both ends of those spectrums and every place in between, and especially pulling in this polyvagal lens, that there's nothing wrong with the sex drive, regardless of where it falls on that spectrum. But what is important is to acknowledge the link that our sex drive has with the perception of safety that's present. And as a woman, I've certainly understood this and seen this in my clients as well, that there is a greater likelihood of sex having been an unsafe experience. And there's absolutely men that have experienced that as well. Um, but it is far more likely among women that I can't fully activate my social engagement system while engaged in sexual activity because this has previously been unsafe for me.
Yeah.
And so oftentimes, especially when females come in with lower sex drives, a lot of our work will be kind of processing how we can make sex a safer experience. I have so much expectation, I have so much psychological pressure, right? That's even if sex is a safe experience with my partner and I want to, I still have kind of this psychological stress weighing in of what expectations are present, how often is this needing to happen, like kind of and just like the stress that can be stored in our bodies from prior sexual trauma that we may have had that we're aware of, or maybe less aware of just from vicariously hearing about things or watching things play out in media. And so a lot of my work with them is how can we make sex a safe experience? What if we just engage in some sexual touching but not experience sex in itself? And so it felt really important to include that here too, linking these ideas of safety and sex because they are so, so interconnected.
Yeah. I think you're hitting on like one of the biggest unsung things, right? You know, the AIDS study, right, said that I think 27% of, middle class white women have been sexually assaulted, right? Like that's a lot.
Mhm,
It's a lot of people. And so for a
mhm,
lot of women, sex has not been a safe situation.
mhm,
And I think that we really need to be aware of that. And I think things have shifted, but for a long time, for a lot of people, um, that was sort of just swept under the rug, you know,
mhm.
um,
Absolutely.
which is which means that a lot of people went through a lot of women went through a lot of pain
Mhm,
and were told that they were crazy and told that it was
mhm,
just them for way too long, way,
mhm,
way, way too long.
mhm.
Um,
And and sorry, I want to acknowledge too that maybe someone when listening are like, well, that hasn't been my experience, right? But even acknowledging the weight that of the psychological stress that hearing about another woman's sexual trauma, the way that that carries of saying, oh, that could be me. Even the ways that we see that play out in media and our culture is saturated with here's what's expected sexually, and this is what an exciting, fun sexual relationship looks like. All of that,
Pressure.
right?
Yeah.
Even though I haven't had my own explicit direct sexual trauma, right? If that's you, but I still have this low sex drive, you've still, right, felt the weight of the sexual pressure and stress, and expectation that's there that carries a weight of its own.
Yeah. Yeah. You know, there's I'm quoting like way too many books, but there's a wonderful book called Come As You Are by Emily
Mm.
Nagoski. I don't know if we talked about it before, but it is a book written for women. And half of the book, a third of the book, is her just dispelling all the myths that we have.
Mm.
And she really does a great job of dispelling the myths. And I think this goes back to what you're saying, right? Is there's so many myths about sex and sexuality in our culture,
Mhm.
that can impact women
Mhm.
on that psychological side of stress. And then you layer in the fact that, at least a quarter of middle class women have been assaulted
Mhm.
before the age of 18. Like, so then you also have like the trauma layer, right? It's like no
Mhm.
wonder for lots of women, not all women, but for
Mhm.
lots of women, there's a lot of stress and shame attached to
Mhm.
this.
Mhm.
And if we want people to have full sexual experiences, but also full choice, right? For them to be able to
Mhm.
choose to have this sexual experience or not, we have to sort of begin to educate people and also create more safety for people
Mhm.
to have their experience.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Beautifully said, Jordan.
Wow. Anything else, Julia?
That's really what I wanted to cover there. I know you're excited about the next part. I am too.
I'm excited about the next part. Well, some of the stuff I just find so fascinating. I feel like that comes out a lot because I never took a physiology class, unlike you, right? And so the learning about how our bodies work to me is just interesting.
Mhm.
Um, and so this next section is he talks about, okay, so people often have infertility issues. So one of the ways that they try to work with that is through in vitro fertilization. Um, and he actually kind of starts off with like a downer, right? He basically says like, IVF is actually not that effective. It was like, it's kind of depressing, right? Um, he says, technically it's really hard to know how effective IVF is
Mhm.
because these clinics are working with the hardest cases,
Mhm.
right? They're working with the hardest for fertility cases. Um, and then he says, but also let's not underestimate the role of stress,
Mhm. Mhm.
right? Like having fertility issues can be hard and stressful on a relationship. Then, if you choose to go get treatment for that, that's not usually covered by insurance, even today, right? So you got to pay 20 grand out of pocket. Where does that money come from?
Mhm.
And then, these are usually, these IVF clinics are usually located in major cities. And so if you don't live in Dallas or wherever, New York or, some San Francisco or wherever the clinics are, you got to drive there or fly there, stay in a motel for weeks on end, not be around your family and friends,
Mhm.
you know, like that's all stressful. And then, you know, you have doctors poking at you, prodding you, hooking you up to machines. Um, like the whole system is this really stressful
Mhm.
experience. And for me, this was sort of like the biggest sort of polyvagal light bulb that sort of popped off of like, oh man, how important it is if you're in that situation to have support, right?
Mhm.
To feel like your
Mhm.
partner has your back, to be able to call your parents or your friends or whoever back home, to really have doctors who have great bedside manner, you know, to find whatever ways, eh, whatever other ways to keep that social engagement system on, so that that stress response doesn't inhibit the reproductive cycle.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think we both probably know people that have been through this process and know how incredibly painful it can be, and just the toll that it takes. And so I think Zapolsky's perspective in this is to kind of not discourage those that are seeking this out, but to kind of appreciate the level of stress the body is under, right? And to recognize this is an incredibly taxing process. Of course, physically, right, with all the tests that are being done and all these scans and all these things, right? Financially, yes, but socially and relationally, what impact this can have. And recognizing the weight of that, I think, is so important, from a clinical perspective, from just a relational, from a human perspective, right? And then exactly like you said, how much more important is it that they have a village around them, appreciating the weight of that experience for something that is so incredibly heartbreaking. And so just really wanting to honor the risk that they're taking in that process, because that is a lot to ask of your body, both physically and psychologically.
Yeah, especially I think for bodies that are probably more sensitive to stress and for when it comes to fertility, right? Like if you're going in for in vitro fertilization, your body, for whatever reason, finds fertility harder. And so maybe your body's already more sensitive then to the things that can sort of throw a wrench in the fertility cycle. So for people like that, we really need to appreciate it and be respectful of that. And I don't know, I mean, the people that I've known who've had issues like this, I think they've been very lucky to go to good places and have doctors who are very knowledgeable and who will even just like explaining, right? This is what you can expect. This is what's going to happen next, so that it's predictable. And I hope that most clinics are like that. I don't know if they are, but I hope that they are, because that really makes a difference to people.
Yeah. Or maybe it's just because if they're friends with you, they've got a really good village behind them that keeps stress low. Is that just like a very humble flex of yours?
Oh, no, that was not a humble flex, Julia, but thank you. Thank you. So, yeah. Yeah, so that was really impactful to me. What else in this section?
I think you covered it pretty well. I would really love to see some sort of like study. As I was reading this, I was like, man, I'd love to see some sort of study, comparing what impact does, like the level of social support around people have on this process and the effectiveness of it. I think that would be really powerful to see, not because we want people to be without support, but maybe that could be granting additional funding for support groups, or some sort of like group counseling process as they're walking through that, that I think that could be really valuable for them. So I'd love to see like a body of research on that, kind of showing what impact does it have when they're able to connect, when they're able to activate those social engagement systems consistently. No, it doesn't mean it's the end to this stress, but it does allow those parts to come online that we need to, that the reproductive needs system needs in order to result in pregnancy.
Yeah. Yeah. So I think the question that he ends with at the end of this chapter, I think is like the perfect question. Because he basically says, so how much impact does stress have on the female reproductive cycle?
Mm.
And he's like, with all of these things, that we know about how stress impacts hormone levels and how stress impacts fertility and all that other stuff, like how much impact does stress actually have? And he actually says, well, it actually has to be a lot of stress, right? Like it has to be a lot of stress. And he tells this story and he gives a big caveat, right? Because he's like, a lot of this data we have comes from really horrible experiences of women in concentration camps, right? Because the Nazis took all these sort of records. So it's not a good thing that we have the information. But what we know from those studies is 54% of women in concentration camps stopped menstruating. And he said, that's actually means that 46% of women kept menstruating. So when it comes to stress and the impact on the fertility, the reproductive cycle, it's gotta be a lot of stress. It's gotta be a lot of stress. And to me, that sounded like, that old quote, life finds a way, like the female body is very resilient. It's very resilient. So it takes a lot to knock it off track. I don't know. I found that very hopeful in some way.
That is optimistic of you. I had a darker thought in that I do think that this is abnormally high, especially considering kind of this process, in reading and being familiar with the dynamic of concentration camps. Even when people first arrived, there was kind of this selection process of, you look healthy enough to do this work, we will keep you. And that people that were not seen in a specific condition were deemed just non-essential. And so I think that was kind of on my mind as I was reading this, of this is only a very specific portion of people that were deemed worthy by the people that ran these camps. And so it is hopeful in the sense that it's not just this, if I've experienced terrible trauma, if I have gone through a period of restricted eating, this doesn't mean that this is like now my fate, right? But it does mean that what would those statistics have been if we actually had an accurate sample, right, of all women, of different body sizes, of different levels of health or whatever was used to gauge that, of different ages, that I think that would give us maybe a more accurate estimate as well. But it does offer some hope there that our bodies are incredibly resilient. And this is one of the most basic functions that it has. It's not something I'm ever conscious of or feel like I've got much control over, right? And so it's one of the strongest systems that operates on that subconscious level. And I think this is a study and an inspiring story that shows that resilience.
Yeah, I mean, that's actually a really good point, though, right? We don't want to overly rosify this, right? Like something horrible happened and there's a selection bias that happened, right? And so a survivorship bias of the people who were initially just murdered weren't part of this sort of study. And so you're right, we definitely need to respect that.
I'm always willing to be your Debbie Downer to your optimist. No,
So
that
rarely
that is
happens, you know, it
that
so
is
rarely
a
happens.
service I will always offer.
I guess here's the next question. I think part of my optimism was also based on what he talks about with the fat stores, right?
Mm,
And so it sounded to me that for many people, not all the time, but for many
mm,
people, once you're removed from that environment, once you've been able to get better nutrition and better food,
mm,
then the fertility process, the reproductive process comes back online.
mhm. Yeah, I thought about that as well because, and especially comparing it maybe to that the gymnast like competitive running statistics that we talked about before, right? Where only 20% of them had started menstruating um, by 14, and I think you're spot on with that. Of we can maybe assume that prior to going to those concentration camps too, that there was adequate levels of nutrition and activity and fat stores. And so this was a temporary, devastating,
Yeah.
but temporary state that they were in, and that we see, um, yeah, just the resilience of the body to bounce back from that temporary state, as opposed to this is a steady state that I'm constantly living with this low body fat. I'm constantly living with kind of this version of portion control, um, and this high degree of muscle. That I think that you're spot on there.
Yeah. All right, Dr. Conroy, so what's your takeaway from this chapter?
Man, I am such a broken record, but I've got something like a nuance to my broken record, if that helps. Because I feel like every time we sit down to talk about this, I'm like, how incredible is the body, right? And the way it seeks to protect us and to keep us safe and to optimize energy where it deems it to be most necessary. But I think the part that just made me like get a little bit more amazed by it, I think this week, is not only does it do that for the present, but it also has this anticipatory effect. And by that I mean, specifically when we were talking about the way that the female productive system will shut down because it's like, no, we don't have enough fat to do what we need to do, right? For there to be a reproductive system that's fully functioning, you're not going to have, right, what you need based on that. That not only does it tell us what we need in the present and prioritize that, it also collects this data on our current functioning to project how equipped it's going to be in the future, to help us be equipped for that as well. I just think that's amazing. And so that extension, to the anticipatory preparation just blew me away today.
Yeah, I hadn't thought of it in that perspective about our body saying, okay, 9 months from now, maybe not. So let's not do this right now. Let's slow things down.
Mhm.
And I
Mhm.
love how you talk about that, right? In the book, um, Sapolsky sort of talks about it as shutting down, but I think you're right, right? Because it's not really a binary of on or off.
Mhm.
What it's going to do is it's going to slow down the reproductive cycle. And I thought that was very insightful.
Mhm.
I think for me, my takeaway was the same thing, but in a different way, right? Of just how necessary fat is for the female body,
Mhm.
whether it's nursing, right?
Mhm.
You got to have the extra calories in order to breastfeed, right? Whether it's having entering puberty, you got to have those fat stores in order to enter puberty. Whether it's menstruation, you got to have those fat stores, or your
Mhm.
body's going to slow down that cycle, right? And it's just like,
Mhm.
wow, like I think we so rarely hear about the positive function of fat. Like your body's doing
Mhm.
something important,
Mhm.
like and it needs that energy, which fat is energy for a reason.
Mhm. Mhm. Mhm.
It's not like if you could just get rid of all the fat, you'd be good. Like that would be a bad thing. That would be a bad
Yeah.
thing, you
We're
know? And so
malfunctioning there.
you're
Yeah.
right. And so just how important it is
Mm.
and to understand the positive function of fat, especially
Mm.
for our females. So that to me was really,
Mm.
really good.
And what a countercultural message, but what a beautiful one.
Yeah,
Mm.
there you go. All right, Dr. Conroy, I'll see you next week.
All right, I'll be here. Thanks.